Now this religion, this global warming religion, if you think about all the attributes it's got a doomsday, okay? The apocalypse is around the corner, okay? And it can't tolerate heretics. It has to persecute heretics. And it has to, there's a faith, and you cannot deviate from that faith. And then of course, like all religions, it has the chief witch doctor, and that of course is our dear friend Al Gore. Now I have to confess, I have been a little bit obsessive about Al Gore for 22 years. I've been the pub bore about Al Gore. When I sit down and have a few beers with my mates, I keep bringing up Al Gore because he is the most significant human being that has lived this millennium so far. It used to be Osama bin Laden, the first decade of this century. Al Gore and Osama were the two biggies. Osama got killed. The war on terror has ended. We don't actually hear people say that the war on terror has ended, but it has. I mean, there used to be big, Islamist-inspired mass terrorist attacks, whether obviously New York and Washington, but also Bali and Madrid and London and Pakistan and the Philippines and Indonesia. They've all stopped. Okay, we got rid of Osama, got wiped out, but Al Gore lives on. Now, I want to understand Al Gore. And I know this is a highly intelligent room, so you've got to stick with me here. Now, the first person we need to understand about Al Gore is a fellow called Roger Revelle. Who's Roger Revelle? Roger Revelle, I know that the global warming debate is highly contentious. The one figure that both sides will all agree was a very distinguished academic was Roger Revelle. Roger Revelle was a lifetime academic. His first half of his career was at the Scripps Institute for Oceanology in San Francisco, and then the second half was at Harvard. In 1957, well, let's go back to the 1800s. In the mid-1800s, when people have started to understand chemistry, a debate from a few different people around the world, in Germany and other places, people asked the question, is the increase in carbon dioxide as a result of industrialisation, is it going to warm the planet? It was an academic debate. And then in 1957, Roger Revelle at the Scripps Institute said, well, let's measure this thing. And there was a worldwide cooperation. So this is the height of the Cold War, but the Soviets were very helpful. All around the world, they put water buoys in the ocean and on land and other places, and they had all these measuring instruments. And the question was, what's happening to all the carbon dioxide? So they thought, look, since the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide has probably gone up about 20%. Where's it going? And they did this research, led by Roger Revelle in 1957. And the conclusion was, well, about half of this carbon dioxide is simply getting absorbed into the ocean, but the other half is not. So what's happening to it? And Roger Revelle said, well, look, it may well be responsible for a term that he called global warming. He was the first person to use the term global warming. It was in the Washington Post in 1957. And Roger Revelle met with congressmen in Washington, and he spoke to a meeting. He said, look, this could be an issue. And he was 0% a politician, 100% a very sincere scientist. And then when he's at Harvard in the 60s and the 70s, he was teaching his courses, and he would tell his students, look, there is this debate, there is this interesting question about what's happened to the excess carbon dioxide. Is it warming the planet, and if so, is it dangerously warming the planet? Now, just by chance, there was a student at Harvard at that time called Albert Gore Jr. Now, what did he study at Harvard? Okay, he didn't study science, okay? He studied history, he studied politics and media. And Al Gore is brilliant at those two subjects. Okay, but he did take, like a lot of people do with an arts degree, he did take one course in science. And very faithfully for all of us and the whole world, that course he took was with Roger Revelle. And I think that Gore got this little concept of global warming, he put it in his knapsack, and he thought, you know, I might be able to use that one day. So just a little bit of background on Gore. Gore's mother was a staffer to Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wife. big time lefties. Not entirely communists, but pretty friendly with communists, those Roosevelts. And so she was a real lefty. Now, Al Gore Sr., Gore's father, was someone from Tennessee, worked his heart out, got involved in the Democratic Party, and became a senator for about 32 years, representing Tennessee. In 1956, Gore Sr. was absolutely desperate and came very, very close to being the Democratic Vice President. They lost to Eisenhower anyway, but he very much wanted to vote. Just trying to remember the name of the Democrats' presidential candidate in 1956, but anyway, it doesn't matter because he lost. But Gore Sr. very, very, very much wanted to get himself on that ticket, and he narrowly missed out. Now, by this stage, they've got a 6-year-old son called Al Gore, and the two parents decided that he had 2 other sisters, but there was Al Gore. They raised him to be the president. They channeled all their energy into young Al to being the president. And so, of course, and look, he's a good-looking boy. He's obviously bright. Of course, there's only one university for Al Gore to go to since he's a future president. That's Harvard. He goes to Harvard. He's the student president the first year. One of these student politicians, the worst types. And they don't go to university to learn. They go to become the student president. And that's where Gore took this course with Roger Revelle. He got this little global warming thing in his head. Now, at that time, Al was in his early 20s. There's a little war going on called the Vietnam War. And there was a lot of conscription in the United States. A lot of senators' sons could easily get out of conscription, but the future, of course, was for Al to be in Congress one day to run for president. So he was going to be asked one day, well, did you serve in the Vietnam War? Now, the Gore family were left-wing Democrats. They hated the Vietnam War. Al Gore wrote in the Harvard student magazine, anti-communism is an obsession, it's a delusion, America is borderline fascist, so they hated the Vietnam War, and the family for months wrestled with, do we send our dear precious Al to Vietnam or do we not? And then they finally decided, they said, look, let's send him over there so we can say he's been there. And part of that was that this was 1970, there was a Senate election. Al Gore Sr. Was running to get re-elected to the Senate from Tennessee. He had been anti the Vietnam War, but he said, but my son is going to serve. Now, Al Gore Sr. lost that election because he was too left-wing for Tennessee this time. But young Al went to Vietnam. Now, I have read 5 biographies of Al Gore. All 5 of them were written in 1999-2000 when he's running for president. A very interesting thing is this. Every person who's run for president or vice president in the last 100 years, from what I can see, has written their memoirs, because they sell quite well. You can be an unsuccessful leader of the opposition in New South Wales, like Kerry Chikarovsky or something. Most of them write memoirs. Al Gore has never written his memoirs. And the reason he hasn't written his memoirs, he's written a lot of other books. He loves talking about himself, but he won't publish his memoirs because he's so ashamed of his past, and it's irreconcilable with what he stands for today. And I'll explain why. So he goes to Vietnam, and in all the memoirs, even the memoirs that are favourable to him, they say he went nowhere near the front line. He smoked pot and played basketball in Saigon. and there was a little, and of course he's a senator's son, okay, so but there's photos of Al with a rifle out in the cane fields, okay, all made up, all manufactured. All the people that were with him in Vietnam said, look, he just had a good time in Saigon. Now then what happened, there was a way to get out of Vietnam. Normally you go to Vietnam for 2 or 3 years. There was a way to get out. You can be over in Vietnam and you can say, I have heard the call to serve God and become a religious minister. And that's what Al Gore said. He said, I've decided to become a religious minister, a Baptist minister. So I said, oh, okay, no worries, Al. You're now extracted from Vietnam after 5 months. But Vietnam served the purpose. I served. I'm a military hero. Okay? All BS. So then he comes back to America, studies to be a Baptist minister for about 3 months, then changes his mind. Okay. Now then he's sort of in his mid-20s by now, and his father had been a congressman before he was a senator, and then the seat became available. Al's about 26, 27. He was working as a reporter, doing a few property deals. Al instantly says, I'm going to run. But this is 1976. The problem was, Daddy Gore had lost in 1970 because he was too much of a lefty. Tennessee is the Bible Belt. So what did Al Gore run on in 1976? Not global warming, I can promise you that. This was the old Southern Democratic Party. He campaigned on being pro-life, pro-tobacco, anti-gay, pro-guns, pro-Jesus. He said he's a born-again Christian in 1976. All this right-wing stuff. And he gets elected. Now then, soon after that, a great thing happened in the history of Western civilization was Ronald Reagan became the president. And then this was the Reagan era. Gore's in Washington. He becomes a senator in 1986. And he was in the Democratic Party, but he was on the hard right of the Democratic Party. He was so hard right, he started this thing, he and his wife, called the Parents Music Resource Centre, which was extremely controversial. Because what it was all about, it was saying that in rock and roll music, there was backward satanic messages. Remember all that stuff?
Yeah.
All crap, invented by Al Gore. Well, other people had proposed it, wackos, and then Al Gore made it famous. Al Gore held all these congressional hearings saying, oh, there's satanic influences in rock and roll, all this heavy metal stuff is bad. It went on for about 3 years. Al Gore became a very controversial figure. He was very much a Southern Democrat, big right-winger. Al and his wife were the equivalent of Fred and Elaine Nile in the 1980s. Now, when I point this out to people, and then they go and read that fabulously reliable website called Wikipedia, they say, well, it's not even in Wikipedia, okay? Well, that's because Al and his mates at Silicon Valley have scrubbed the internet. But there's one thing they can't scrub, and that's the 5 published biographies, which I've got and read twice. I've read them all twice. So it's all through it, okay? They were hardcore Southern Democrats. Didn't give a stuff about global warming. Never occurred to them. And then, in 1988, Al Gore runs for president. He would have been the youngest president in the history of the United States. He was 39 years old, and he ran in the Democratic primary. Now, this is the year that George Bush I ended up winning. But in the Democratic primary, there was Michael Dukakis, and there was Jesse Jackson, who was sort of the first serious African-American presidential candidate, the first one with a chance of winning. And there was Al Gore. And Al Gore ran as the pro-Christian, pro-guns, pro-tobacco, anti-gay, anti-abortion. That's my alarm, thanks, Rob. He ran as this big right-winger in the Democratic Party. When Jimmy Carter ran for the presidency and won the nomination in 1976, he campaigned as a born-again Christian. Now, the Democrats have changed a lot, obviously. Gore was really the last gasp, Gore in 1988, of the right-wing Southern Democrats. I mean, these were the guys, the Southern Democrats were the ones that left the Union because they wanted to keep slavery. Okay, so that's the origin of the Democratic Party. Okay, and so Gore was sort of campaigning now. So he runs in 1988. Michael Dukakis wins the nomination, but Gore and Jesse Jackson had this almighty fight for about four or five months. You know, in these primaries, these presidential primaries, there's a lot of mud throwing, negative ads. Okay, well, Gore was fighting Jesse Jackson so he could get into the final two, and he threw a lot of racist dirt at Jesse Jackson. And African Americans did not forgive Gore for some time. And what really brought down Michael Dukakis that year was the Bush campaign ran this ad on TV about Willie Horton. Willie Horton was a African American criminal who'd been in jail for murdering people. Michael Dukakis, as the governor of Massachusetts, had let him out early, and 2 days later he goes and kills another couple. And so it was a big scandal. It was Al Gore that dug up that thing about Willie Horton, and which the Republican Party ended up using. Okay? And it's a very messy story how Gore tried to bring down Jesse Jackson. Very nasty and malicious.
Yeah.
and Gore lost. He came third in that primary, but it was a very dishonourable third, and Gore was broken-hearted after that. He thought, oh my God, yeah, I've really hurt myself here with the Democrats. But he's not going to give up. He's only 40 years old. Destiny says he's going to be the President of the United States one day. So what does he do? 3 months after he drops out, he writes an article for the Washington Post. What the public needs to know about global warming. He had made the calculation, look, being a right-wing Southern Democrat, there's got no future in this party. He can't join the Republican, because a lot of Democrats did join the Republican Party around this time. He couldn't join it because his dad was a big Democrat and everything. So he says, I've got to reinvent myself. I'm going to become the hero of global warming. It's the first time the public had heard about it. Now this is where we get back to our friend Roger. So what does Gore know about science? What could Gore teach about science? Nothing. Okay, except he said, oh, well, when I was at university, I learned from the highly esteemed Roger Revelle that carbon dioxide is warming up the planet. And this is about, and it really took off. It was the first, what had been an academic debate, a non-partisan academic debate, became a highly political thing because of Gore. Now then he became famous. Now and the Democrats forgave him overnight. They said, "Oh, we love you, Al." Now why did the Democrats latch on to global warming so quickly? Well, I'll tell you why. Because for most of the 20th century, the Western left had been sympathetic to socialism. I'm not saying they were communists. Some of them were. But they were sympathetic to socialism. Now, what we saw with the Reagan-Thatcher revolution was we saw before our eyes communism collapse. You know, one almighty collapse. You know, the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union 2 years later. So what they sort of hitched their wagon to, which was a bigger state to regulate the economy, was now in disgrace. The success of Reagan and Thatcher had sort of won the argument, so we thought. They won the argument, and so the left needed a new cause. I was assuming at that time that they would say, oh, well, look, we were wrong about the economy, and the right-wingers were right. Yeah, we need to deregulate, privatise, you know, cut taxes. But no, they wanted a new cause, and who gave it to him? Al Gore gave it to him. So he becomes a bit of a celebrity again. Now then at this time, Gore's making a lot of noise. I grew up in Tamil, I was about 19, and everyone starts talking about global warming in the late 80s, all because of Al Gore. And to cover his obvious lack of having any scientific credibility, he basically said to the world, look, I am, St. Paul was to Jesus, or St. Paul was the communicator of Jesus' sacred message to the world, and Roger Revelle is like Christ, and I am his messenger of this sacred message. Now then, Roger Revelle is an old man at this stage. And the interesting thing is, after a lifetime of research into this question of what's happening to the carbon dioxide, are we getting warmer? Roger Revelle by now has had doubts, serious doubts, and he's published those doubts. Like before Gore even took it off, he wrote an academic paper in about 1984-85. He says, you know, look, I've been studying this all my life. He said, you know, it's really not a clear-cut matter. Case. There might be something else about where this carbon dioxide is going, but there doesn't seem to be much evidence of it. Now, of course, this was terrible for Gore. Okay, but it got worse. In 1991, Roger Revelle is an old man, but all of his colleagues said he was as sharp as a tack till the day he died. And some people can be old, very old, on the verge of death, and unlike Joe Biden, they haven't lost their brain yet. And Roger Revelle was one of those people. And so Roger Revelle and a fellow called Fred Singer, and another fellow who doesn't really matter, because I can't remember his name, but it's not particularly important. They wrote an article in the very respected scientific journal called Cosmos. Yeah. And this was in mid-1991. This is after Gore has told the whole world how magnificent Roger Revelle is, and he's tried to create the impression that he's close to Roger Revelle. There's no evidence, there's no photo of them together. Okay, but they wrote this article for Cosmos called Global Warming, Look Before You Leap. You can find it online, it's about a 7-page article. And what they say is, they say, look, we are a little bit concerned here that the public's getting carried away with this global warming thing when we, the scientists, the three of them were just hardcore lifelong academics, not political people. They said, we've got our doubts about this. We're not sure it's true. And they say, we're not saying it's not true, but we are concerned about the alarmism that has now infected half of our politics and our media. And we're please saying, look before you leap. Mm-hmm. Now, when that came out, that was kryptonite for Al Gore. Okay, but the media covered for him. No one paid any attention to it, which was unfortunate. Gore was bracing for it, and Gore was just hoping, look, let's just hope no one pays any attention to this academic article. That was in 1991. Now then, sadly, a few months later, Roger Ruddick died of a heart attack. Okay, now, then the next year, in 1992, Gore, of course, is desperate to be the next president of the United States, but he made a decision to not contest the Democratic primary in 1992. Now, why was that? The first President Bush actually had a magnificent presidency. We had Tiananmen Square, which showed us how bad the communists were, and Bush managed that process pretty good. We then had a little thing called the Berlin Wall come down. We then had the magnificent operation of the first Gulf War. Now, the second Gulf War was a total disaster, obviously, but the first Gulf War was brilliantly executed. It was all because of George Bush. They didn't sort of overreach and say, well, let's go and invade Baghdad, you know, and they got the world coalition together, and big bad Saddam had invaded little Kuwait, and, you know, it was a beautiful war. Very low American casualties. And then the Soviet Union fell over in August 1991. And they're thinking, okay, well, the Republicans have been handed an evil empire and everything. So, of course, George Bush is going to get re-elected. So, Gore calculated, you know, when you needed to make a decision about whether you're running for president in 1992, Gore says, I'm going to sit this one out. I'll leave it till 1996. But then a little thing called a recession came along. It wasn't a big recession, but at the time, when a recession's on, people are a bit worried about it. And it had been 12 years of Republican rule. And then an unknown person, the little-known governor of Arkansas, called Bill Clinton, who is appealing. He's a likeable bloke. Doesn't come across as a radical lefty. He certainly wasn't at the time. He's from the South, a Southern Democrat as well. And Al Gore was 10 times more famous than Al Gore at the beginning of 1992. But then Clinton nominates, and when there was about 7 Democrats that nominated, and no one had heard of any of them. And President Bush said, they remind me of the 7 dwarfs. And so, then we had the Ross Perot situation, which was hurting Bush. Perot got about 19% of the vote, which is a lot, you know. He was really a pre-incarnation of Trump, but we won't get sidetracked. Anyway, by mid-1992, Bill Clinton is the Democratic nominee, and he's looking pretty good. Now, Gore's furious about this. He's thinking, oh my God, why didn't I run? You know what, we're going to have this commoner. We're going to have this little nobody, this grub from Arkansas run. But Clinton's got 2 problems. Number 1, he's a womanizer. Number 2, he's a draft dodger. So who does he want as his vice president? Well, he wants this morals crusader from the 1980s. He wants the guy that's been campaigning against, you know, getting smut and Satan out of all the rock and roll music. And of course, Gore's a veteran. You know, he's not quite, you know, Dwight Eisenhower, but he can say he's a veteran. So Clinton rings up Gore and says, I really need you to be my vice president, you know, morals crusader, veteran, and you've got all this global warming stuff going on as well. And it is so bittersweet for Gore. He said, oh God, you know, I don't want to be the vice president, I'm meant to be the president. And the Gore family, because his parents were still alive at that stage, they ummed and ahed about whether they should accept it. And they sort of agreed, and they were all just irate about it. But they just thought, he's going to win, so it'd be better off you are as vice president. They made Clinton sort of sign this little secret pact where he'd almost be a co-president. And Clinton said, yeah, whatever, I'll sign whatever you want, yeah. Anyway, so Gore joins the ticket, they win the election. Oh, sorry, I've skipped ahead. 1 week after Gore being announced as the vice president, this article in Cosmos, now that he's a vice presidential candidate, It should have been news a year earlier. Now it's big news. Oh, Al Gore, you're talking about global warming all the time. You're talking about how Roger Revell's this great person, Mr. Gore. Roger Revell has disowned this. Not entirely disowned it, but Gore had created this idea that the science is settled, because Roger Revell says so, and it's an imminent apocalypse. Revell, on the other hand, says, well, it's certainly not settled, and it's absolutely not an apocalypse. Okay, if it is happening, we've got a lot of time to adjust. So then Gore is then stuck. He's thinking, I've staked all my rehabilitation has been on the great Roger Revell. Roger Revell, who's now dead, but he'd written this article. So Gore, of course, comes out and says, very foolishly, he says, well, Roger Revell did write that article. He says Fred Singer wrote that article, and this other person. And Fred Singer, who's just an academic, not a political person, he says, what the hell are you talking about? Roger Revell was one of my closest friends and one of my closest associates all my life. This is complete nonsense. Gore says, no, he didn't write it. In one of the presidential debates, the vice presidential debates, Gore is asked about this. He says, oh, no, Roger Revell was misquoted. Anyway, so then they get elected in 1992. Gore keeps saying that Fred Singer has misrepresented Roger. Fred Singer says, Mr. Vice President, you better retract that or I'm going to sue you. And then, sorry, let me go back. That's why I want to chat, because this is a little bit. Okay, there's this fellow called Justin Lancaster. Justin Lancaster was a young guy in his 20s who had been Roger Revell's sort of helper in his old age. He was an academic helper. And it was Justin Lancaster who came out and made this claim that Roger had nothing to do with the paper about saying global warming's BS, and it's all Fred Singer's fault. So Fred Singer publicly says to Justin Lancaster, you better retract that or I'm going to sue you. Justin Lancaster says, no, I'm not going to retract it. Fred Singer sued him for defamation, for libel, what they call in the United States. And that gave them access to private correspondence. And what do we find out in that private correspondence? Gore had been, and his star, had been intensely involved with Justin Lancaster. Justin Lancaster had written an academic paper saying, it's all BS, Fred Singer wrote this article, not Roger Revell. Well, then it came out, that paper was written by Gore's staff, and they gave it, the political staff, writing a scientific paper. Wow. And so Justin Lancaster was extremely embarrassed, and, well, by extension, Gore. Anyway, that went on for a while, but in 1993, he says, look, I apologise. I made it all up. He gave a written statement and said, I made it all up. He said, yes, Roger Revell did write this paper. Roger Revell's family came out and said, yes, this is Roger's paper. And in that, and it was extremely embarrassing for Vice President Gore. And of course, he only wants to be the Vice President so he can be the President one day. It was extremely embarrassing. The whole global warming thing became a big liability for Gore. So some of you will remember in the late 1980s there was a big boomlet in global warming. It sort of died off, and it only came back to life in 2007 when Gore again brings it back to life. It was sort of dead. There was Kyoto in the 1990s, but not much. So Gore then calculates, it was such a scandal for Gore early on in the Clinton presidency that there was talk that Clinton's going to have to drop him to be the vice president in 1996. So Gore just said, okay, I've had enough of this global warming stuff. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. So they just dropped it. Gore went on and was a hard-working vice president, invented the internet, of course, and he forgot about global warming. What he had only been saying in 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, the world's going to come to an end very quickly. We need to take drastic action now. All of a sudden, because of the political scandal, he just forgets about it. And then, of course, Gore runs for president in the year 2000. Now, when you're a presidential nominee, when it's all confirmed, you have your party convention, and the party's nominee gives, a half-hour speech, a big major speech, maybe an hour speech. Gore spoke for an hour at the Democratic Convention in 2000, talked about 1 million policies. Global warming got 4 words. He called it He said it's a silent threat. So gone was the fire and brimstone. That's how much he cared about it in 2000. He thought it wouldn't be a vote winner. Okay, so then what happens in 2000, the 2000 election? We have a very freak result, which is going to happen in a democracy occasionally. So America at the time was a population of 300 million people. The vote came down to 537 votes in Florida, and there's a big bun fight over it. Now Gore on election night rang up Governor Bush, said, "Congratulations, Mr. President, I am conceding the election to you." I remember where I was, all the networks, it says, George W. Bush, the next President of the United States. And then we're sitting around waiting for Gore to come out and concede, or Bush to speak, but they're silent after about an hour and a half. What's happening? And the rumours come out, Gore has retracted his concession. Now, I am pretty sure that is the first time in the history of democracy that somebody has retracted a concession. It was an act of bastardry. He took it to the Supreme Court and he lost. Now, I truly believe that moment and that 5 weeks of the Florida recount so polarised America that the dreadful division we see now in a country which I'm sure we all love and admire, the United States, I trace it all to Gore's retracting his concession. Now, in 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon ran for the presidency against John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy won. I believe there was fraud in that election in Illinois and Texas. And Richard Nixon thought there was fraud. But President Eisenhower, the outgoing president, said to Vice President Nixon, he said, "Look, for the good of the country, please don't contest this." And Richard Nixon didn't contest it. Okay? And that is exactly what Al Gore should have done in 2000. Now, you know how they talk about red state America and blue state America? You know what happened before 2000? They used to alternate the colours. So one year the Republicans would be blue, the Democrats would be red. Then the next presidential election they'd alternate. Why is that? Because no one wanted to be the red colour, because the commies were the reds, right? The Soviet Union was the red. Okay, so they would alternate who's red, who's blue. America got so divided in 2000 that those labels are stuck. Republicans are red, Democrats are blue. It all started in 2000. Now then, that was obviously very, very embarrassing for Gore, that loss. But what it made him do, it made half of America hate George W. Bush. And George W. Bush, this is hard to remember, in the campaign in 2000, George W. Bush was the cool, confident guy. He was a very popular governor of Texas. He was really cool, happy, cracked jokes. Gore was the awkward policy wonk. But then what happened was, after Bush becomes the president, under these dreadful circumstances where Gore's running around America for the next 8 years saying, "Oh, I won the election, it was robbed," and all of his supporters in the media say it was stolen, it was stolen, it was stolen. That really put Bush off kilter. It put him off balance. And I think that's I sort of think that's sort of why they overreacted in Iraq. But again, we won't get distracted there. But now the day after, this is the moment that my fascination with Gore began. It was the day after the recount. There was a lot of pressure. I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room remembers that. It was a very, very big deal, the Florida recount. Dick Cheney the next day has a minor heart attack, rushed to hospital. George W. Bush, Mr. Cool, confident governor of Texas, has a big boil blow up in his face. That's how much stress there was. And I'm thinking, where's Gore? Where's Gore? So we've got two of them who had heart attack, massive boil in his face, stress, stress, stress. The only picture we saw of Gore that day was he was playing touch football with his family, with his kids, and looking cool, calm, and collected. And they were playing touch football on his estate, just so the media could just peer through them. So he just looked like he was so relaxed. And I thought to myself, that is brilliant. That is very, very smart, and that is very, very, I've paid top points for that in terms of the PR of this situation. He's just put America into this, terrible situation. Anyway, so he loses in the High Court, 5-4. That's how divided things were. And then, of course, Gore could say, "Oh, well, it was my George W. Bush's daddy had appointed half of these Supreme Court justices. They just undermined America, okay, and polarised America. Anyway, Gore was very, very quiet for a few years. This hyper-ambitious person. And a lot of people thought he might run for the presidency in 2004. I said, no, I think he's saving it up for 2008. He's going to make a big comeback in 2008. But very interestingly, in 2004, Gore did come out and gave a very strong endorsement early on to a candidate called Howard Dean, who at the beginning of the Democratic primary in 2004 was the only person who was against the Iraq War. Now, by the end of that Democratic primary, they were all against the Iraq War because we'd gone to hell. But Gore had very much gone and locked in the left-wing base of the Democrats by endorsing Howard Dean. Okay, so then we're into Bush's second term. Gore's gearing up, and he comes out with an inconvenient truth. Okay, now by this stage, the left-wing media would just let him get away with anything. He was the person who was robbed of the presidency. He was the martyr. He was this great liberal martyr, and the evil George W. Bush, who's given us this dreadful war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a bad economy, and Bush had a terrible presidency. He was always looking awkward, nervous, and everyone thought, oh, you're only there because your daddy's there. It's probably true. His daddy was the president. So Gore, with the full, unquestioning blessing of the media, right? He's thinking to himself, how am I going to reinvent myself? Well, how did I reinvent myself last time? What worked last time? Global warming did. When I lost that Democratic primary in 1988, global warming saved me in 88, and by God, it's going to save me again. It's going to rehabilitate me again. So he comes out with an inconvenient truth. The book, the movie, the Nobel Prize, the Academy Award, and wherever he go, he was on par. He still is on par with Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela. You know, he's like this figure who's above politics. He's above politics. And so we would all remember the hoopla in 2000. Now, John Howard, on balance, I've got my criticisms of him, pretty good Prime Minister. Better than any other bastard we've had this century, right? And John Howard went along with it all. I'm sure he didn't believe it. You know when Kevin Rudd beat John Howard? And obviously they have the lodge very professionally clean when we're talking about Prime Ministers. But Kevin Rudd writes in his memoirs, and this is one thing I believe Kevin Rudd on. They've cleaned everything out in the lodge, but the cleaners forgot to clean out one thing: the DVD that's in the DVD player. It would be something that you could easily forget, isn't it? Yeah. And Kevin Rudd says he presses the DVD thing. What comes out? The Great Global Warming Swindle. So the Howards were sitting at home. Remember that documentary? Yeah. Terrific, great climate skeptic documentary. So John and Jeanette Howard were sitting in the lodge watching the Great Global Warming Swindle. They know the truth, but John Howard went along with it all. Everybody had to go along with it, right? Now I know the climate skeptics of 5 Doc didn't go along with it, right? We're about the only ones. And so Gore, you know, basically convinces governments all around the world that we've got 10 years to go. And it gets into our curriculum, it invades all of our politics and our media, and it's now this big new religion. It's this big new religion. Now then the thing is, I thought Gore was going to run for president in 2008, but he's greater than a president.
He doesn't have to be.
No, that's right. He's like, he can go anywhere in the world and he's treated like he's God. Okay, and what's he done? Like all these false religions, every false religion's got something in common. Money, money, money. Right? So they've set up, him and Gore and his mate David Blood, set up this company. Blood and Gore, can you believe that? That's right. Blood and Gore. And all these renewable energy schemes in every country in the world, okay, most of them at least. All these schemes, money-making schemes, manufacturing solar and wind turbines and everything else. At the end of the day, you know, Gore's investment company's got his little fingers in a hell of a lot of them. A hell of a lot of them. And this 10 years ago, the New York Times, might have been back 6, 7 years ago, the New York Times, which is pretty pro Al Gore, they wrote an article saying that they think he's on track to being the world's first climate billionaire. Okay, and that was 6 years ago. Okay, so he's, look, it is an extraordinary story about Al Gore. And the thing when I was saying in 2007, 2008, I was saying this is a fad, This is not going to last. It's not based on science. It's so obviously political. But when I realised it was ominous with the East Anglia ClimateGate scandal, which I'm sure a lot of you know. So I can't remember the details, but I think somebody's got the emails from these academics. You know, one of the top academic research centres for global warmingism in England. They've released the emails to the public. Might have even been Julian Assange, but and they're saying, "Oh, the data's not fitting our models. What are we going to do about it? Oh, we'll just change the models. I'm pulling my hair. I can't believe it." Okay, so now that was fairly widely reported. You couldn't have been a journalist and missed the ClimateGate scandal, but it was ignored by the public because the journalists decided they don't want to report on it. Okay, and this is where we're at. And now how is this going to turn around? At some point, reality's got to kick in. I think, the left can be great haters. They hated John Howard, they hated Tony Abbott, they hated George W. Bush, but nothing. They hated Richard Nixon. Nothing compares to the left's hatred of Donald Trump. Okay. They hate Trump more than anything in the world. Okay. Now, why is that? I think it's because Abbott, Howard, George W. Bush, other sort of right-wing leaders have gone along with the global warming BS. They know it's not true, but they've gone along with it. Plain citizen Trump walks in off the street, walks into the White House, and he just says exactly what he thinks. He says, "I think it's crap." And that's why they hate him more than anything else. Okay, so look, that is the Al Gore story, ladies and gentlemen.